Greetings, dear subscribers and casual listeners of my channel. The name Severus Snape stirs a storm of emotions. He went from a hated professor to a tragic hero whose sacrifice brought tears even to the most stoic readers and viewers. His story became one of the most powerful and unexpected twists in the Harry Potter saga. But did he truly become a good man? Let's pause here. Redemption in Harry's eyes is not the same as redemption in life. Behind the noble image lies a complex and far from flawless character. Let's take off the rose-colored glasses and take a clear-headed look at Snape. Number 1. Favoritism toward Slytherin. Let's start small. As the head of Slytherin, Snape blatantly favored his house, ignoring misdeeds and showering his students with praise. Meanwhile, he was ruthless with other houses, especially Gryffindor. The most vivid example, Neville Longbottom. Snape became a living nightmare for him. More than that, he literally embodied Neville's greatest fear, turning into a boggart version of himself. That alone speaks volumes. Number 2. Humiliating Hermione about her appearance. Many overlook this moment since it was cut from the films, but in Goblet of Fire, Malfoy accidentally hits Hermione with a curse that causes her front teeth to grow grotesquely large. Snape simply sneers, "I see no difference." For a girl already self-conscious about her looks, that was a cruel blow. And when Harry and Ron tried to stand up for her, they lost 50 points and were punished. Is this how a grown teacher should behave? Number 3. Constant provocations towards Sirius. Yes, Sirius and Snape had a difficult past. But while Black matured and became calmer, Snape seemed stuck in teenage resentment. He knew exactly how to wound Sirius, constantly poking at the sorest spot, his forced isolation at number 12 Grimmauld Place. Some argue that Snape's constant jabs may have pushed Sirius to take reckless action and walk straight into a trap, one he never returned from. Snape wasn't a killer, but his hands weren't clean either. Number 4. The Occlumency disaster. When Harry needed to learn how to protect his mind from Voldemort, Dumbledore assigned the task to Snape. The result? Total failure. Instead of guidance, there were clashes. Instead of support, pressure. And when Harry accidentally saw one of Snape's painful memories, Snape just cancelled the lessons altogether. The outcome? No defense, vulnerability to the Dark Lord, and another tragedy. Number 5. The Sectum Sempra spell. As a teenager, Snape invented a dangerous curse that slashes opponents as if with a blade. He named it Sectum Sempra. J.K. Rowling never explained why he did this. But the fact remains, a teenager created a weapon that could kill. Even if he didn't use it often, this says a lot about his personality. Withdrawn, inclined toward dark fantasies and revenge. Number 6. His resentment toward Harry over James. From the very first lesson, Harry became Snape's target. Why? Because he looked like James Potter and the boy who stole Lily from Snape. Snape couldn't forgive that. And he took out all his bitterness on Harry. The constant nitpicking, insults, and sarcasm weren't the marks of a strict but fair teacher. They were the actions of a bitter adult who never got over the past. Number 7. He was a Death Eater. Yes, he switched sides. Yes, he helped Dumbledore. But facts are facts. Snape willingly became a follower of Voldemort. His motives? Likely pain, loneliness, and bitterness. But thousands of others suffered too, and they didn't choose to serve evil. Snape made that choice. He paid for it. But being a hero is not the same as being a good person. Number 8. Publicly humiliated Neville. Neville's potion hissed, then bubbled, then turned a sickly green. He froze. The class held its breath. Snape's eyes narrowed. He stalked toward Neville. Silent, cold. Then he snapped, "Is it possible, Longbottom, that you followed a single instruction?" The room went still. Someone snorted. Laughter bubbled up. Neville shrank in his seat. Snape didn't stop. He picked up the cauldron, still steaming, and swept out of the room. The class sat stunned. Then they heard it, his voice echoing in the hallway. "This, ladies and gentlemen, is what failure looks like," he called. "Brewed by the most hopeless student Hogwarts has ever seen." Students passing by turned, stared. Some laughed, some whispered. Neville's name was suddenly everywhere. He couldn't hide, couldn't breathe. Every corner of the castle echoed with it. Hopeless! That word stuck to him like a curse, all because Snape wanted to prove a point. And he did, not about potions, about power. He humiliated Neville not to teach, but to feel tall, to feel in control. And Neville? He disappeared a little more that day. Even Hermione didn't know what to say. Ron cursed under his breath. Harry clenched his fists. Number 9 informed Voldemort about the prophecy. Snape started it, not with a wand, not with a curse, with a whisper. He was in the hog's head, a shadow in the corner, listening. Trelawney's voice trembled. "The one with the power to vanquish the Dark Lord." That was all he heard, all he needed. He slipped away, ran to Voldemort, gave him the prophecy like it was nothing. Voldemort acted fast. A child born at the end of July. 2 possible targets. Neville Longbottom, Harry Potter. But Voldemort chose Harry, and the Potters were marked for death. Snape realized too late. He hadn't known the child was Lily's son, the woman he claimed to love. His panic was instant. He rushed to Dumbledore, begged him to protect her, just her, not James, not the baby, only Lily. Dumbledore's voice was cold. "You ask for no mercy for the husband and the child," Snape said, "just her." No hesitation, no shame, only obsession. It wasn't love, it was control. Lily died. James died. Harry was scarred forever. Snape wept. But his regret didn't erase what he did. He put ambition first. Put Voldemort's trust above innocent lives. His guilt came after the graves. Number 10 wanted Dementors to take Sirius. Snape wanted Sirius dead, not imprisoned, not questioned, dead, and he wanted the Dementors to do it for him. When Sirius escaped from Azkaban, Snape didn't panic. He smiled. His old rival was back. And this time, Snape had the law on his side. A murderer, they said. A traitor. Perfect. Snape didn't care if it was true. He just wanted revenge. In The Prisoner of Azkaban, Harry, Ron, and Hermione discover the truth. Peter Pettigrew is alive. He framed Sirius. They beg Snape to listen. He refuses. "Out of the way, Potter!" he snaps, wand raised. His hand trembles, not with fear, but fury. Lupin tries to explain. Sirius confirms everything, but Snape isn't interested. He doesn't want the truth. He wants payback. "I knew he was dangerous," he growls, and then he tries to bind them all. Children, teachers, doesn't matter. Nothing will stop him. When Sirius escapes on Buckbeak, Snape loses control. He storms the castle, screams at Dumbledore. "They helped him," he shouts, wild-eyed. His voice echoes through the halls. He's not grieving a lost prisoner. He's grieving the death of his vengeance. He demands punishment. For Sirius, for Harry, for everyone. He wants Harry expelled. Hermione too. No respect for authority, he spits. No respect for me. It's not justice, it's pride. He knew what Dementors do. He wanted them to do it, to end Sirius. No trial, no second chances, just cold, silent death. A kiss that would rip out his soul. Dumbledore warns him, tries to calm him, but Snape won't hear it. "You always take their side," he hisses. "You protect the wrong people." His voice shakes, not with fear, with hate. Number 11, bullied students to boost his ego. Snape didn't teach, he dominated. His classroom wasn't a place to learn, it was a place to survive. One wrong word, one shaky hand, and you became his target. He didn't hide it. He enjoyed it. The way he prowled between cauldrons, black robes whispering behind him, eyes sharp like knives. He waited for mistakes, hunted for them. And when he found one, he struck, not to correct, to humiliate. Neville Longbottom felt it every day. In the Philosopher's Stone, he melted his potion. Snape loomed over him. "Why don't you pour the rest of your potion on your toad, Longbottom?" he sneered. "Might make it more useful." The class laughed. Neville didn't. He looked like he might cry. Snape smiled. That wasn't discipline, that was cruelty, and it didn't end with Neville. In The Half-Blood Prince, Snape turned on Hermione too. She raised her hand, again, eager, bright, hopeful. Snape looked at her and snapped, "You are an insufferable know-it-all." She froze, her hand dropped, her face fell. No praise, just poison. Snape knew what he was doing. That's what made it worse. He didn't lose control. He chose his words. Chose humiliation. Because it gave him power. He didn't lead with respect. He ruled with fear. In the Goblet of Fire, he caught Ron and Harry whispering. Did he warn them quietly? No. He raised his voice, grabbed Ron's head, yanked his face forward. "Do you want me to do it again, Weasley?" he growled. The whole class watched. No lesson was learned, except to stay silent and stay small. Snape wasn't just strict, he was a bully, one with robes and a wand. He never inspired, he intimidated, and students didn't admire him, they tiptoed around him. Number 12, refused to save James and Harry. Snape begged. He fell to his knees in front of Dumbledore, not as a hero, as a desperate man. Voldemort had chosen Lily Potter. She was going to die, and Snape was terrified. But not for all of them, just for her. "Hide them all, then," Dumbledore said. His voice was cold, testing. "Keep her, them safe, please." And then came the question that burned through the moment like fire. "You ask for no mercy for her husband and child?" Snape's reply was instant. Only for her? Just her. He didn't stutter, didn't hesitate. James Potter, he didn't care. The baby, a nuisance, an obstacle. In that moment, Snape's heart didn't beat with love, it pulsed with obsession. He didn't think about what Lily would want. She loved James, she lived for her son, but Snape didn't care. He wanted her alive, even if she woke to find her family slaughtered. That wasn't love, that was selfishness wearing a mask. Dumbledore saw it. He didn't argue, just stared. Disappointed. "You disgust me," he would say later. Because how could a man call it love and ignore the lives of an innocent child and a devoted husband? Snape's pain was real, his loss was real. But his priorities were twisted. He didn't try to save a family. He tried to save his Lily, his version of her, frozen in a memory from youth. A girl who once smiled at him before she chose James. And what if Dumbledore had agreed? What if he'd protected only Lily? Voldemort would have killed the child, killed James, and left Lily broken. Snape didn't think that far, or maybe he did, and just didn't care. This wasn't a moment of sacrifice. It was a moment of weakness, of blind, burning obsession. He didn't offer his life, he offered theirs. Number 13, humiliated Lupin and exposed his secret. Snape didn't forgive, and he never forgot, especially not the laughter, not the way James Potter and Sirius Black mocked him, and not how Remus Lupin just stood there, silent, watching. Years later, Lupin came back to Hogwarts, kind, tired, older, a better man, but to Snape he was still the enemy. From the first day, Snape moved like a shadow behind him. He brewed the wolfsbane potion, yes, but every drop came with venom. He made sure students knew. His voice lingered on Lupin's name. His eyes held secrets. Something's wrong with that teacher. He wanted them to feel it. And then, the essay. In The Prisoner of Azkaban, Snape looked at his class and said, "Werewolves. That's your topic. Random? Not at all. He wanted them to connect the dots. Lupin had just missed class. He looked pale, weak. Snape handed the clues to the students with a smirk. He replaced Lupin that day, took his class, didn't hide the venom. "Turn to page 394, he ordered coldly. The page screamed the truth. Werewolves. His stare burned into Harry, into Hermione, as if daring them to say it. He wasn't teaching, he was hunting. Later, in the hospital wing, Snape's mask slipped. He burst in like a storm, furious. "You don't know Potter like I do," he growled. "Lazy, arrogant." But he wasn't talking about Harry anymore. He was back in school, drowning in the past. And Lupin stood quietly, just like before. And then came the betrayal. The whisper that turned into thunder. Snape let it slip. Not in a shout. In a soft, sharp slice. "Lupin is a werewolf," just enough for it to spread. Parents panicked, papers stirred, Hogwarts turned cold. Lupin packed his bag in silence. Number 14, presumed guilt without proof. Snape didn't wait for mistakes. He expected them, especially from Harry. From the moment the boy walked into his class, the verdict was in. Guilty. No trial. No chance. In the Chamber of Secrets, when Ron and Harry crash into the Whomping Willow, Snape is furious, but not like a teacher, like a judge. "I suppose you thought it clever to enter the school like that," he snarls. He doesn't ask why they did it. He doesn't listen. He wants them expelled. "I shall be speaking with Professor Dumbledore about this," he hisses, and he means it. Snape didn't just punish bad behavior, he hunted it, assumed it. Neville Longbottom was terrified of him, and for good reason. "Why don't you try again, Longbottom?" Snape sneered. "Or are you afraid of causing another explosion?" That wasn't teaching, that was humiliation. Even Hermione, the brightest witch of her age, felt the sting. In The Prisoner of Azkaban, she appears in class without being seen walking in, a mystery. But instead of asking, Snape snaps, "Miss Granger, I would advise you not to attempt to be cleverer than you are. No curiosity, no wonder, just suspicion." And Harry? He was guilty from day one. Not for anything he did, but for being James Potter's son. "You are just like your father, strutting about the castle," Snape growls in The Order of the Phoenix. Harry hadn't done anything. But it didn't matter. Snape already decided. In the Philosopher's Stone, during the Quidditch match, Harry's broom goes wild. Hermione sees Snape muttering and thinks he's jinxing it. She sets his robes on fire. The twist? Snape was actually trying to save Harry, but no one believed it. Why? because Snape had built a legend, one of cruelty, one of hatred. Number 15, ignore danger to Katie Bell. It happened on a cold afternoon in Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince, somewhere between the still-falling autumn leaves and the ever-thickening suspicion that something at Hogwarts wasn't right. A scream tore through the air like a knife. Katie Bell, a well-liked Gryffindor student, hovered mid-air, her body contorted in pain, arms outstretched as though something invisible were pulling her apart. She had just touched a mysterious black velvet box, inside it a cursed necklace. And as her friend Leanne screamed in horror, the entire school was reminded that Hogwarts, no matter how protected, was no longer safe. It wasn't long before professors arrived. The whispers began instantly. Who sent the necklace? Who was the target? The object was quickly identified, a deadly piece previously displayed at Borgin and Burke's, cursed so violently it could kill upon touch. "I didn't mean to touch it," Katie had shrieked before collapsing, her voice warped by unseen magic. The moment was terrifying, but what happened afterward, or rather what didn't happen, was even more chilling. Professor Snape, the enigmatic potions master, was not just a bystander in this story. He was deeply entwined in its roots, aware of dangerous threads long before they strangled a student. In fact, he had known, suspected if not confirmed, that Draco Malfoy was involved in dark deeds. Yet when Katie nearly lost her life, Snape did not storm into action. He did not protect. He did not warn. He watched. He calculated. And he remained frighteningly detached. The evidence was mounting. Draco had been acting suspiciously all term. He isolated himself, whispered with Crabbe and Goyle, disappeared for hours, and grew paler and thinner with every passing week. Dumbledore had tasked Snape with watching over Draco, yes, but Snape's role, however crucial, had a cost. That cost was paid in the screams of Katie Bell. And when she returned to Hogwarts weeks later, pale and changed, Snape offered no public comment, no sign of remorse. Let's not forget Snape's own words. In The Half-Blood Prince, during a heated discussion with Draco, Snape says, "I swore to protect you. I made the unbreakable vow, Draco." These words are laced with hidden urgency. He knew what Draco was attempting. He knew a student was carrying out Voldemort's orders, and yet, when an innocent girl fell victim to Draco's dangerous plan, Snape showed no concern beyond what was necessary to maintain cover. Even Dumbledore, often accused of being overly strategic, showed more warmth in this incident than Snape. When Harry voiced his concerns about Draco, Dumbledore didn't dismiss them outright. He acknowledged that the darkness was creeping in. But Snape, who had the authority, the insight, the knowledge, remained a silent guardian of something far more terrible. He protected plans, not people. Some may argue he was bound by duty, that his role as a double agent required him to suppress emotion. But where do we draw the line? Katie Bell was not a pawn. She was a human being, a friend, a daughter, a student. And while Snape's allegiance to Dumbledore may have demanded secrecy, it didn't demand apathy. When someone nearly dies, silence is not strength, it's complicity. There was no apology, no visible regret. Katie's brush with death became a line in a report, a footnote in Snape's ledger of morally grey choices. And though we understand he walked a delicate balance between two worlds, his failure to express any compassion makes him hard to defend. "I had to let it happen," he might have said, though the words never appear in the book. But that excuse, that mantra of necessary sacrifice, rings hollow when a child nearly dies in agony. Snape's detachment is haunting. In one scene, Harry, furious and desperate for answers, confronts McGonagall and the staff about what happened. He demands to know who cursed the necklace. He's certain Draco is involved, but Snape? He sits in the shadows, letting others speak. He neither confirms nor denies, offering no aid in the search for truth. Inaction here becomes a form of betrayal. To understand the gravity of the situation, we need to consider how close Katie came to death. The curse was strong enough to kill instantly. Her survival was a miracle, not a result of Snape's protection. In fact, she was saved by prompt intervention and sheer luck. A fraction of a second longer, and the story would have ended in tragedy. And Snape? He would have marked it as an unfortunate casualty of a larger cause. This cold calculation strips away the romanticized image some hold of Severus Snape. He is often portrayed as the tragic hero, the man who loved Lily Potter so deeply that he risked everything. But love that doesn't extend to others, that doesn't protect the innocent, begins to look less like heroism and more like obsession. Where was that love when Katie Bell writhed in pain? Imagine, for a moment, that Katie had died. Would Snape still be defended so passionately by readers? Would his silence still be seen as noble? Or would we finally admit that he let a girl fall victim to a curse he could have anticipated, maybe even prevented? Draco's involvement was no longer a secret to him. His refusal to act sooner was a decision, not an accident. Even Harry saw it. He told anyone who would listen, "I think Draco Malfoy gave Katie that necklace." But every time he said it, it was dismissed. The adults around him, especially Snape, refused to entertain the idea, not because it was impossible, but because it was inconvenient. And when the truth finally surfaced, no apologies were made. The silence remained. What makes this story so troubling is not just what Snape did, but what he didn't do. There's a difference between having to keep secrets and choosing to look away, between protecting a student and enabling danger. Snape may have believed he was playing the long game, but in doing so, he let real people suffer. And in the case of Katie Bell, the suffering was nearly fatal. Number 16. Emotionally manipulated Harry. The hospital wing at Hogwarts was never quiet for long, and that night it hummed with anticipation and fear. The Battle of Hogwarts raged beyond the shattered windows, yet within its stone walls another kind of battle brewed, quieter, more intimate, more devastating. As Severus Snape lay dying on the floor of the shrieking shack, his black eyes locked onto Harry's, and with his final breath he released a memory. Not words of encouragement. Not an apology, but a demand wrapped in the shroud of memory. Take it. And so Harry took it, his mind and heart unprepared for what would follow. In that moment, Snape, ever the master of subtle cruelty, ensured he would manipulate Harry's heart one last time. When Harry poured the silvery contents into the pensieve and fell into Snape's memories, he was not just a boy witnessing a confession. He was a pawn cornered into a fate no child should ever carry. In the swirling vision, he saw a younger Snape, eyes wide with awe and fear, watching a girl with red hair fly through the air like a beam of sunlight. "She's only a Muggle-born," said Petunia, her voice sharp and dismissive. But Snape saw something divine. He loved Lily Evans from the moment he saw her, and that love was the foundation for every decision that followed. Yet he never told Harry, never trusted him with this truth while alive. He waited, orchestrated, and only after his own throat had been torn open by Voldemort's snake did he choose to unveil it. Why? Snape could have explained himself at any time. During the sleepless nights at Grimmauld Place, in Dumbledore's office, even during the quiet lulls between classes at Hogwarts. Instead, he remained cold, cryptic, and cruel, ensuring that Harry never saw him as anything more than a twisted, resentful teacher. His words in Order of the Phoenix still stung. You are just like your father, lazy, arrogant." And yet, after death, Snape carefully curated a story of martyrdom, highlighting his undying love for Lily and conveniently editing out the years of torment he inflicted upon her son. Snape's memories were not given freely in life because they were never meant to be a tool for understanding. They were a weapon of control. He gave them at the precise moment when Harry would be most vulnerable, standing on the brink of the final confrontation. What better time to drop a truth so emotionally overwhelming that it could not be questioned? Harry saw the tender look Snape once gave Lily, saw his broken heart after her death, saw him kneeling before Dumbledore pleading, hide them all." And just when the pain of watching a broken man beg for Lily's protection began to soften Harry's heart, Snape delivered the final blow. The prophecy must be fulfilled. Harry must die. Dumbledore's voice echoed through the memory. "You were the best of us." But was he? Snape's timing was too perfect, too theatrical. He knew Harry's heart. He had watched it break and mend over the years. He had seen him lose Sirius, then Dumbledore, and finally Remus. Snape knew what guilt Harry carried for the people who had died protecting him. So, in death, he crafted one final moment that would crush Harry's resistance and leave no room for doubt. "Look at me," he said in his dying breath, not as a teacher to a student, but as a broken man desperate to be remembered, not as the villain, but the tragic hero. Yet even in that plea there was manipulation. Snape didn't want forgiveness. He wanted to be immortalized in Harry's heart. The memories were not only a confession, they were a trap. Harry, burdened by the fresh trauma of the deaths around him, watched a lifetime unfold in a matter of minutes. He saw Snape cradle Lily's corpse, crying not for James, not for the child in the crib, but for the woman who had never returned his love. "You disgust me," Lily once said, her voice sharp and final after he had called her a mudblood. That wasn't a fleeting mistake. It was a crack in Snape's soul that he never truly repaired. Yet Harry, drowning in emotion, saw only pain and sacrifice. It was too much. Snape knew it would be. He designed it that way. Snape's manipulation wasn't new. From the very first moment they met, he toyed with Harry's mind. "Fame isn't everything," he sneered in their first potions lesson. He read Harry's face, sensed his confusion, and took pleasure in it. For years he singled him out, humiliated him in class, punished him for his father's crimes. He didn't just dislike Harry, he made it his mission to remind the boy of his hatred, and yet, with his dying breath, he painted himself as a guardian. But protectors don't torment the ones they protect. They don't force children to bear unbearable truths with no warning or support. In The Half-Blood Prince, Snape made a vow to Narcissa Malfoy, a vow that would eventually lead to Dumbledore's death. He fulfilled that promise, but not for Harry's sake, not for the cause. He did it to preserve his role, to stay close to Voldemort and Lily's son, as if his presence, no matter how painful, was enough to honor her memory. But Lily would never have wanted her child to suffer. She would never have approved of Snape's cruelty, his bitterness, his refusal to change. And yet, Snape believed his love justified all. What Snape gave Harry was not guidance. It was emotional blackmail. He didn't ask Harry to die. He showed him enough pain, sacrifice, and loyalty to make the choice inevitable. And Harry, raised to be brave, noble, and selfless, did exactly what Snape knew he would do. He walked into the forest ready to die, not because he understood the plan, not because he believed in prophecy, but because Snape had pulled the right strings at the right time. It was not courage, it was conditioning. Number 17. Never admitted his own faults. He stood in the shadows watching the boy he had sworn to protect, the boy who carried her eyes, and yet, even in those eyes, he could not find absolution. Because Severus Snape, brilliant, bitter, broken, was never able to do the one thing that could have truly changed his path, admit his own guilt. From the moment Lily Evans turned away from him at the edge of the lake, horrified by the word that slipped from his mouth, Severus Snape began building a wall. Brick by brick, lie by lie, he constructed a fortress of denial, so dense not even love could soften it. "I didn't mean it," he told her, voice thick with desperation. "I'm sorry." But sorry wasn't enough. And more than that, he didn't say what needed to be said. He never said, "I was wrong," because to do that would have meant tearing down the mask he wore so carefully. In Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix, when confronted with the trauma of his school years, Snape's instinct isn't to reflect on what went wrong, but to deflect, to lash out. When Harry sees the memory of his father bullying Snape during occlumency lessons, Snape doesn't seize the chance to explain or to grow. Instead, he explodes, get out, I don't want to see you in this office ever again." There's no maturity here. No adult perspective that says, "I was hurt, but I also hurt others." Snape had a chance to connect with Harry to break the cycle of pain, but he didn't. Pride won again. When Dumbledore asks him to protect Lily's son, Snape doesn't say yes because he has changed. He says yes because Lily is dead. His words are chilling in their selfishness. Very well, but never tell Dumbledore. This must be between us. Swear it, I cannot bear, especially Potter's son. I want your word." The focus is not on the boy, not on penance, but on protecting himself from emotional discomfort. This is not redemption. This is bargaining with guilt. Throughout the series, Snape had countless opportunities to say something as simple as, "I was wrong." To Harry, to McGonagall, to Lupin, even to Dumbledore. But he chose silence or sarcasm every time. The moment he finds out that Voldemort intends to kill Lily's son, does he confront Voldemort's ideology? No, he simply begs for Lily's life. He doesn't say this is wrong. He says, spare her, not the child, not James, just Lily. Because again, it's not about what's right, it's about what he wants. A good person makes peace with their flaws. They offer apologies, not as currency, but as acknowledgement. Snape never reaches that place. His encounters with Sirius Black after his return show this clearly. "You don't like me, do you, Snape?" Sirius says with a smirk. Snape's reply, "You are an incorrigible troublemaker who does not know when to keep his mouth shut." But the truth is, Sirius, too, was a child once, a foolish, reckless boy. They could have talked, they could have healed, but Snape's identity is so built on old wounds, he can't let go of the past. Even in death, Snape doesn't ask Harry for forgiveness. He gives him a memory that shows he once loved, that he did brave things, but not a word is spent acknowledging the cruelty he dealt to Harry year after year. "Look, he whispers, and it is touching. It is tragic. But it is not healing, because healing requires admission, a reckoning. And Severus Snape never opens that door. In The Prisoner of Azkaban, when Snape tries to have Sirius executed without a fair trial, it's not justice. It's revenge. He lets old grudges steer his morality. He tells Fudge, "You see, he's got no wand. He's helpless." There is venom in his voice, not principle. And when Harry intervenes, insists on the truth, Snape doesn't pause. He roars, because he cannot separate right from personal vengeance. A good man can, a good man must. The tragedy of Snape is not that he was hated. It's that he thought being hated made him right. He wore his bitterness like armor, believing it proved how much he had suffered. And perhaps he had, but suffering doesn't absolve cruelty. Suffering doesn't grant the right to cause more pain. And still, Snape never said, "I became like them. I lashed out. I was wrong." One of the most damning examples lies in his treatment of Neville Longbottom, a child, a frightened boy who made a mistake or two. Snape's reaction is beyond discipline, it's emotional violence. He mocks Neville in front of others, uses him to amuse Slytherins. He doesn't teach. He punishes. And in The Goblet of Fire, when Moody, or rather Barty Crouch Jr., turns Draco into a ferret, Snape's only concern is Draco's pride, not the act of humiliation which he himself inflicts routinely on non-Slytherin students. Contrast this with Remus Lupin. When Lupin returns as a professor, he acknowledges his past failings, he speaks of his condition openly, teaches with care, protects students. He is humble. Lupin is a flawed man who owns his flaws. Snape is a flawed man who buries them under layers of disdain. In The Half-Blood Prince, he offers Draco protection, but only because of a vow, not because he truly forgives or has grown. He is bound by duty, not empathy. When he kills Dumbledore, Snape does so under secret orders, and it is a horrible task. But even then, he makes no explanation. He lets the world believe he is a murderer. Admirable in a way. Noble even. But imagine if, even once, he had sat with Harry and said, "I am not who you think I am, and I am sorry for how I treated you." Imagine the healing that could have begun. But no, instead, he calls Harry arrogant, a liar, a show-off, the very things he was called as a child. He becomes what he hated, without ever facing it. Dumbledore, with all his manipulations, still tells Harry the truth in the end. Snape never does. His truths come in death, through memories, not through words freely given. Number 18 allowed Slytherins to bully others. The atmosphere in the dungeons of Hogwarts was always colder than the rest of the castle, and perhaps it was fitting that the students of Slytherin, ambitious, cunning, and often ruthless, called it home. But what made those shadows darker wasn't the stone walls or flickering torches, it was the silent approval of their head of house, Severus Snape, who, by turning a blind eye, allowed cruelty to fester unchecked. From the moment Harry Potter stepped foot into Hogwarts, the imbalance of justice was palpable. During his very first potions lesson, Snape took aim at him, not because Harry had done anything wrong, but because of who he was. As the class watched, stunned, Snape humiliated the boy in front of everyone. "You are here to learn the subtle science and exact art of potion-making," he said silkily, pacing before the class. "I can teach you how to bottle fame, brew glory, even stop a death, if you aren't as big a bunch of dunderheads as I usually have to teach." But it wasn't just Harry who felt the sting of Snape's tongue. Others were targeted more cruelly, not by words, but by the very students Snape was supposed to guide. Draco Malfoy was a perfect example. Arrogant and sharp-tongued, he strutted through the halls with his usual entourage, Vincent Crabbe and Gregory Goyle, always ready to ridicule or intimidate those they considered beneath them. And Snape? He watched and did nothing. Neville Longbottom, shy and clumsy, often bore the brunt of Draco's cruelty. During their first year, when the students had flying lessons with Madam Hooch, Neville broke his wrist and ended up in the hospital wing. Draco seized the opportunity to mock him, even stealing Neville's remembrall, a gift from his grandmother. As he soared through the air, taunting Neville, the other students gasped. But when Professor McGonagall arrived and punished Draco for his actions, Snape's reaction later in the dungeons was telling: disinterest. He never once questioned Draco's behavior or addressed it in front of the class. That silence spoke volumes. It wasn't only the Gryffindors who noticed. Luna Lovegood, the dreamy Ravenclaw with a heart of gold, became another easy target for Draco and his friends. Her eccentricities were harmless, even endearing, but in the Slytherin eyes, they were reasons for mockery. Once, as she passed through the corridor wearing her radish earrings and reading the Quibbler, Draco sneered, calling her Loony Lovegood. The insult echoed, laughter followed, and Snape, passing by, offered not even a glance. To those around, it felt as though silence was approval, but it was Hermione Granger who perhaps experienced the deepest sting. A Muggle-born witch with a brilliant mind and relentless curiosity, Hermione should have been celebrated for her talent. Instead, she was reduced to a slur by Draco Mudblood. In Chamber of Secrets, when Draco hurled the insult in front of multiple students, including Professor Snape, the moment was drenched in tension. Ron Weasley, furious, attempted to curse Draco, but the spell backfired. What did Snape do? He punished Ron and Draco, not even a word of rebuke. It was as if the word mudblood held no weight for him. Or worse, as if he didn't find it offensive. Snape's partiality wasn't just passive. He actively rewarded bad behavior. In Half-Blood Prince, he deducts points from Gryffindor and turns a blind eye to Draco's increasingly suspicious actions. By then, Draco wasn't just a schoolyard bully, he was a young man caught in a web of dark expectations. Still, Snape shielded him. One could argue it was part of his larger plan to protect Draco from the Dark Lord, but in the eyes of other students, it was yet another sign that Slytherins could get away with anything, as long as Snape was watching. Even in Order of the Phoenix, when Dolores Umbridge introduced the Inquisitorial Squad, Snape allowed Slytherins to wield unchecked power. Draco, now part of this squad, relished the authority, using it to dock points and detain students for petty reasons. It was a reign of terror, especially for members of Dumbledore's army. One night, as Harry was caught trying to use Umbridge's fireplace, Draco stood grinning, arms crossed. Snape's response, "I have no idea what you're talking about." Not a denial, not a reprimand, just enough ambiguity to let Draco continue with his abuse of power. And what of Neville again, the boy who had grown so much, yet still trembled at the sight of Snape? Why? Because Snape made a spectacle of him, turning every potions lesson into an ordeal. "Why is it always Longbottom who gets everything wrong?" he once snapped. Draco, Crabbe, and Goyle laughed. It was sport to them. And Snape was their referee, silent, smirking, never intervening. The cruelty wasn't limited to verbal jabs. Physical intimidation became part of the norm. In Prisoner of Azkaban during Buckbeak's trial, Malfoy milked his fake injury, manipulating Hagrid's emotional fragility. Snape's loyalty to his house meant he supported Draco's claims, furthering the case against the innocent creature. In doing so, he emboldened Draco. He taught him that lies were tools, and manipulation could win favor. Snape had the power to change the culture of Slytherin. He could have taught his students that ambition doesn't have to come with cruelty. But instead, he let the worst among them dictate the tone. And those who suffered, Neville, Luna, Hermione, and countless others, were left to fend for themselves. No teacher stepped in. And Snape, who should have known better, did nothing. In Goblet of Fire, after Draco mocks the Weasley twins for their lack of money and scorns Hermione for her teeth, Snape doesn't even blink. Instead, he punishes Harry and Ron for loitering. It was a calculated message. Don't stand up to my students, or you'll face the consequences. It's no wonder Slytherin strutted with such arrogance. They knew their protector stood behind them, wand at the ready, not for discipline, but for cover. Even when it came to serious accusations, Snape leaned toward silence. In Half-Blood Prince, Draco begins vanishing from lessons, appearing gaunter, more secretive. Other professors whisper their concern. But Snape? He claims to be helping the boy on Dumbledore's orders. Still, one can't help but wonder. Would he have turned a blind eye so easily if it were a Gryffindor disappearing from class, muttering darkly in corridors? Severus Snape was many things, a brilliant mind, a tragic figure, a double agent, but a just teacher? That he was not. His protection of Slytherin came at the cost of fairness. Students outside his house were left vulnerable. His favoritism was no secret. It was displayed in every sneer, every point unfairly deducted, every instance when he looked away. Once, in Order of the Phoenix, Hermione was reduced to tears after Snape ignored her raised hand for the 10th time in one lesson. Instead, he called on Draco, who gave a laughable answer. Snape nodded approvingly. The message. Intelligence didn't matter, loyalty did. And Hermione's Muggle-born brilliance was an annoyance, not a gift. Even after Dumbledore's death, the scars of Snape's inaction remained. Students like Neville had to fight harder, rise above the damage done. In Deathly Hallows, when Neville leads the resistance at Hogwarts, he stands not only against Death Eaters, but the memory of years of humiliation. His bravery is not just defiance, it is survival. No one expects teachers to be perfect. But students, especially young and vulnerable ones, need to feel safe. And at Hogwarts, Snape made safety conditional. If you wore green and silver, you were protected. If not, you were prey. This is not to deny Snape's sacrifice or the pain he endured, but it's important to see him wholly, not as a hero, not as a villain, but as a man whose silence hurt just as much as any curse. And for students like Neville, Luna, and Hermione, that silence echoed louder than words. Number 19 was cruel to house elves. In the cold dungeons of Hogwarts, where shadows clung to the stone walls like secrets waiting to be whispered, Severus Snape reigned with silent authority. His presence was enough to drain the warmth from any room, and his temper, though often hidden beneath layers of icy composure, flickered dangerously close to cruelty. While his hostility toward students like Harry Potter or Neville Longbottom was well documented, there lies a darker, less discussed aspect of his character, a cruelty that extended toward those most helpless and unseen, the house elves. There is no clearer reflection of a man's soul than how he treats those who can give him nothing. In the case of Severus Snape, the house elves at Hogwarts bore witness to his indifference, if not his contempt. They were the silent workforce of the school, cooking meals, cleaning halls, repairing damage, and tending to students' needs without recognition or thanks. But Snape did not simply ignore them, he actively scorned them. One particularly grim instance involved Dobby, the free elf who began working in the Hogwarts kitchens during Harry's 4th year. Dobby, full of enthusiasm and an almost painful desire to be helpful, offered Harry socks and other small tokens whenever he could. But when Dobby was assigned tasks that brought him into contact with staff, especially Snape, the tone of interaction shifted. Though Rowling did not linger on the details, she gave us chilling glimpses. In Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire, when Dobby proudly announced that he now worked at Hogwarts and received a wage, many, including Snape, scoffed. "A free elf," Snape had muttered with disdain, not bothering to hide the sneer twisting his lips. Snape's reaction was not one of curiosity or support. It was revulsion. His voice, cold as ever, cut through the air like a blade. "Ridiculous, letting an elf take wages. Dumbledore's madness knows no end." These were not the words of a man tolerant of change or kindness. They were the words of someone who saw value only in control, in hierarchy, in obedience. For Snape, house elves were tools, nothing more. If they spoke, he silenced them. If they stood in his path, he brushed past without acknowledgement. Even the most basic forms of decency were too much for him to offer. During one of the rare occasions when Dobby had to deliver a message to the dungeons, it was said that Snape waved him away as if swatting a fly. No thanks, no glance, just dismissal. Such acts, small on the surface, reflected a deeper rot. Contrast this with the kindness shown by others. Hermione Granger, for instance, founded SPEW, the Society for the Promotion of Elfish Welfare, not because she was told to, but because her moral compass could not bear the injustice. Even Ron, who initially laughed at her efforts, eventually came to see the elves as more than magical janitors. But Snape? He remained unmoved. When Hermione brought up SPEW in the staff room, Snape reportedly rolled his eyes and muttered, "Absurd sentimentalism." Snape's indifference is more damning because he himself was an outcast. He knew what it meant to be overlooked, to be sneered at. Yet he could not extend the smallest shred of empathy toward creatures whose entire lives were built around servitude. A good man, it is often said, can be judged by how he treats the powerless. Snape failed this test again and again. Even Kreacher, the bitter elf bound to the Black family, fared no better under Snape's gaze. Though Kreacher was a relic of old pure-blood prejudice, he was still a creature of flesh and emotion. When Kreacher wandered through the halls of Hogwarts during the Second Wizarding War, muttering darkly about half-bloods and mudbloods, Snape's reaction was not to correct, but to ignore. Silence, for Snape, was complicity. He never sought to educate or even challenge the house elf's toxic beliefs, perhaps because those beliefs mirrored his own. There is an unsettling moment in The Half-Blood Prince when Snape visits Spinner's End with Narcissa Malfoy and Bellatrix Lestrange. The elf, Winky, intoxicated and distressed over her dismissal from Crouch's household, is mentioned in passing. Though not directly present, the conversation turns toward useless elves and disgraceful creatures. Snape's face remains neutral, unmoved. Not once does he defend them or suggest compassion. His silence is thunderous. It is telling that even Sirius Black, a man with his own demons, eventually softened toward Kreacher. In Order of the Phoenix, after initial contempt, Sirius tried to connect with the elf, even offering him some degree of respect. But Snape, so often lauded for his bravery and supposed complexity, remained rigid, emotionless. Perhaps it was easier for him to harden his heart than admit that kindness, even to elves, might be a sign of strength. Snape's attitude toward house elves also reflected his general worldview. He valued utility over humanity. He respected Dumbledore because the headmaster gave him purpose. He protected Harry only because of a long-dead promise to Lily. Those who could not serve his personal mission or offer him emotional leverage were cast aside. House elves were invisible to him because they offered no gain. Some argue that Snape's cruelty was a mask, that he played the villain to conceal his true loyalties, but that defense wears thin when examined under the light of daily behavior. Masks are worn in moments of strategy, not in the mundane. Snape's treatment of house elves was not calculated, it was habitual. It came naturally, like breathing. Hogwarts was a school, yes, but it was also a home to many. And in that home, the house elves worked tirelessly without recognition. Dobby, Winky, Kreacher, and dozens of unnamed others cooked meals, fixed broken artifacts, patched robes, and tended fires. They ensured the magical castle ran smoothly. And yet, from Snape, not even a nod. There is a heartbreaking scene in Deathly Hallows after Dobby's death, when Harry insists on digging the grave by hand. "Here lies Dobby, a free elf," the stone read. Harry wept, Ron stood in silence, and even Dean Thomas bowed his head. This act of simple dignity reverberated with meaning. It was the kind of moment that defined character. It was the kind of moment Snape never had. Even when Snape became headmaster with full control of Hogwarts, he did not improve the conditions of those under him. The house elves continued their thankless work as he ruled through fear and silence. Not once did he issue protections for them. Not once did he ask after their safety when Death Eaters roamed the halls. His concern lay elsewhere, with his double life, his secret missions, and his endless grudges. The tragedy of Snape is not that he was misunderstood. It is that he understood suffering and chose to pass it on. He could have been better. He could have reached out, offered kindness in quiet moments, lifted those beneath him instead of pressing them down. But he didn't. The house elves, who asked for nothing but dignity, received none from him. Some say he was too burdened to care, that his mission left no room for softness. But heroes are not made in grand gestures. They are made in small ones, in how they treat the overlooked, the powerless, the voiceless. And in this, Snape was no hero. In the end, Severus Snape's legacy remains divided. To some, he was a man of sacrifice, to others, a man of cruelty. But the house elves remember, and if magic has memory, then the halls of Hogwarts still echo with the sound of silent suffering, where even the smallest voices were ignored by the man in black robes. Number 20 showed contempt for Muggles. Severus Snape stood before the blackboard in his dungeon classroom, robes billowing like storm clouds, voice cold and clipped as he barked instructions to his students. Yet in the eyes of certain pupils, especially those born to non-magical parents, there was something colder than the dungeon air, disdain. Not overt cruelty, perhaps, not always, but something unmistakable, something buried deep in the way he spoke the word Muggle, dragging it out with a curl of his lip, as if the word itself carried a stench. Mr. Finnegan, perhaps if your Muggle mother had taught you to stir properly, your potion wouldn't resemble swamp water. That tone, half sarcasm, half sneer, was one of many small moments that betrayed the truth. Severus Snape, even in his role as a double agent for Dumbledore, never truly shed the prejudices he'd grown up with. One cannot speak of Snape's attitude toward Muggles without recalling the very foundation of his youth, the bleak, broken house on Spinner's End, where a magical boy grew up under the thumb of a cruel Muggle father. Tobias Snape was a man who yelled, who drank, who perhaps struck more than the walls. It was a household where pain and silence walked hand in hand. This environment undoubtedly poisoned young Severus's perception of the non-magical world. For him, the Muggle was not merely ordinary. He was the brute, the tyrant, the symbol of powerlessness and fear. Even after escaping into the magical world, that fear curdled into hatred. It never left him. At Hogwarts, this disdain became armor. Surrounded by students from powerful pure-blood families, Severus chose not to reject their ideals, but to absorb them. He joined the future Death Eaters, learned their language, their superiority complex. It gave him protection, camaraderie, purpose. And while he later betrayed them for Lily, it's crucial to note he never quite betrayed the world view. The ideology was carved into his bones like the runes on a cursed ring. In The Half-Blood Prince, a telling moment occurs when Snape discusses Harry's behavior with Dumbledore. Speaking of the boy's penchant for breaking rules, Snape sneers, he has all the arrogance of his father, strutting about the castle, as if he owned the place. And he's got the cheek of his mother too, Dumbledore gently counters, but Snape's scorn is undimmed. Yet what's striking is the way he lumps Lily into the disdainful commentary. Lily, a Muggle-born, a woman he loved. Even she is not spared his resentment when wrapped in the context of Muggle heritage. It's subtle, but revealing. His language throughout the books often carries this same edge. The word Muggle was never neutral in Snape's mouth. It was a slur, a smudge, a label that said more about his beliefs than he ever intended. When he referred to Muggle parentage, it was usually in a moment of ridicule or reprimand. The magical ability of a student with Muggle parents was always under more scrutiny. Take his treatment of Hermione Granger, brilliant, meticulous, and Muggle-born. Her intelligence should have earned his respect, but instead he belittled her constantly, calling her an insufferable know-it-all, undermining her achievements at every turn. Though he never explicitly mentioned her blood status, the condescension always lingered in the air, sharp as spilled potion fumes. What's more troubling is that Snape's bias wasn't just passive, it surfaced in action. In the Philosopher's Stone, when Neville Longbottom accidentally melts his cauldron, Snape scolds him mercilessly and awards points to Draco Malfoy for simply doing nothing. Neville, a pureblood, is still on the lower end of wizarding competence. But what about Seamus Finnegan, or Dean Thomas, or even Hermione? Any mistake from them seemed to provoke greater scorn. His punishments were never proportional, his anger never blind, it was precise, targeted, and often it fell hardest on those who didn't come from wizarding families. Snape's loyalty to Dumbledore was absolute, but that loyalty had limits. It did not require him to believe in Muggle equality. It only demanded that he protect Harry and, by extension, the Muggle-born students. He did so, but as with many of Snape's virtues, it was obligation, not conviction. He followed Dumbledore's orders, he shielded the children, but love, kindness, belief in the cause, those remained out of reach. Protecting a life is not the same as respecting it. Even in the pensive memories shown in the Deathly Hallows, we see young Snape's shifting gaze when he first boards the Hogwarts Express. He sits with Lily Evans and immediately shows contempt for her sister Petunia. "She's just a Muggle," he says coldly. It isn't just that he doesn't like Petunia, it's the way he uses the word Muggle as if that explains everything, as if that, alone, is enough to dismiss her entirely. Even at 11 years old, his worldview was already infected. There's also the tragic moment when Snape calls Lily a mudblood. This slur, uttered in anger, breaks their friendship. Though he pleads for forgiveness, though he suffers for it, one must ask, how easily did that word fall from his lips? It wasn't invented in the heat of passion. It was already there, resting under the surface. The insult that tore them apart was the insult that revealed the truth. Snape may have loved Lily, but he still held the world she came from in contempt. His disdain even extended into his own self-conception. He identified as the half-blood prince, using his mother's name, Prince, and emphasizing the magical side of his heritage. The name itself is a rejection of his Muggle father, of Tobias Snape and everything he represented. He buried that part of himself. He renamed himself. This wasn't just rebellion, it was shame, it was hatred, it was the seed of something darker. While Snape ultimately risked everything to protect Harry, his motivations were personal. They were about atonement, not ideology. He never gave speeches in favor of equality. He never stood against prejudice. He never taught tolerance in his classroom. Contrast him with Lupin, who treated all students fairly, or McGonagall, who valued talent over bloodline. Snape taught fear, favoritism, and quiet contempt. Even his alliance with Dumbledore was built on conditions. He didn't turn from Voldemort because of his hatred for the Muggle-born. He turned because Lily Evans died. When Dumbledore asks him, after all this time, and Snape replies, "Always, it is a beautiful moment, but it is not a selfless one. It is about personal loss, not moral clarity." He never changed his opinion of Muggles. He simply changed his allegiance. In The Order of the Phoenix, when Harry accidentally views Snape's worst memory, we see the moment when James Potter humiliates him in front of a crowd. But more telling is what happens afterward. Snape's first response is not just embarrassment, but rage. And he channels it at Lily, the one person who tried to help him. "I don't need help from filthy little mudbloods like her," he shouts. The word lands like a curse. It is more than an insult. It is a confession. One must consider how many students went through 7 years at Hogwarts thinking their worth was less because of how Snape looked at them. How many Muggle-borns walked the halls avoiding his gaze, knowing that their heritage would never earn his approval. Snape wasn't Voldemort, but he was not innocent either. His prejudice may have been quieter, but it was there, dripping from every carefully chosen word, every slight pause before he uttered Muggle. It would be unfair to call Snape purely evil. He was complex, tragic, haunted, but he was also deeply flawed. His cruelty was not just a shield, it was a reflection of his unresolved beliefs. Dumbledore saw his potential for redemption, but even Dumbledore never claimed that Snape was a kind man. He said only this: he was brave. Bravery and goodness are not the same. Even in his final moments, as the blood poured from his neck and Harry leaned over him, Snape's thoughts were of Lily, not of the students he taught, not of the cause, just of the woman he lost. Redemption for Snape came not through enlightenment, but grief. He died trying to protect her legacy. But he never let go of the bitterness that poisoned his view of the world. Snape remains a symbol of contradiction, a hero who protected those he couldn't fully respect, a teacher who shaped minds while crushing spirits, a man who gave everything to stop a monster, but who never quite stopped feeding his own shadows. His story is not one of transformation, it is one of sacrifice. And sacrifice, noble as it is, does not erase contempt. In the end, Snape's legacy is not only about love or loss, it is also a caution. That prejudice, once rooted, rarely dies. That even the bravest among us can carry the weight of hatred. And that doing the right thing, while admirable, does not always mean we've become the right kind of person. Number 21. Used legilimency on students. It began with a command that sounded more like a threat than a lesson. "Clear your mind, Potter!" Severus Snape barked, his black eyes glinting with cold anticipation. The room was dim, a private chamber in the dungeons of Hogwarts, and the atmosphere was saturated with tension. Harry stood opposite the professor, wand in hand, uncertain and exposed, as if something unseen had already begun to gnaw at the edges of his mind. Harry was 16, and though he had faced trolls, Death Eaters, and even Voldemort himself, there was something particularly cruel about what was being done to him in these lessons. Dumbledore had insisted that Snape teach Harry occlumency to protect his thoughts from the Dark Lord. And yet, as the sessions dragged on, it felt less like training and more like an assault. The bitter irony, the person tasked with guarding Harry's mind was the very one who invaded it most violently. "Legilimens!" Snape would hiss before Harry could even blink, and instantly the boy would be hurled into a whirlwind of memories, not chosen, not recalled, but ripped open. A cupboard under the stairs, a shriek in the night, a grave in Godric's Hollow. Images he didn't want to relive surged forward, vivid and raw, summoned not by his will, but by Snape's forceful intrusion. In Order of the Phoenix, Chapter 24, J.K. Rowling paints this scene vividly. He was hurtling along the corridor toward the Department of Mysteries, past the blank stone walls, past the torches. The door was ajar at the end. He was inside a circular room. Everything was spinning. The wall with the flaming torch was coming nearer. And then, suddenly, he was yanked back, gasping for breath, while Snape stood over him with disdain. "You are not trying, Potter," Snape sneered. "You are allowing me access to memories you fear, handing me weapons." But Harry was trying. How could he not? He wanted nothing more than to succeed, to stop the strange dreams that pulled him toward Voldemort. But Snape's methods were merciless. He offered no guidance, no empathy, only contempt. His idea of instruction was brute force, and worst of all, Harry had never truly consented. This was not a choice, this was a sentence. What made it worse was that Snape seemed to enjoy it. He lingered too long in the boy's pain. When Harry's mother's scream echoed through the room, Snape's face didn't soften, it hardened. "So you do remember," he said once, his tone unreadable, but his gaze cold. To use such moments, Harry's deepest sorrows, his traumas, as teaching material bordered on sadism. A teacher is meant to protect a student's dignity, but Snape tore it apart. He mocked Harry's memories, belittled his feelings. "Pathetic," he muttered once, after Harry had relived the moment Dudley dangled his birthday cake over the toilet. "You call that suffering?" For Harry, those were real wounds, small humiliations that like bruises piled on top of one another. And now they were being paraded before his tormentor like a carnival of shame. Legilimency, by nature, is invasive. It's a spell designed to pierce the veil of privacy, to read the unspoken. Its use without consent is a violation. In The Half-Blood Prince, Dumbledore himself cautions against its abuse. He once told Harry, "The mind is not a book to be opened at will and examined at leisure." And yet Snape did exactly that, again and again, with no restraint. These weren't just lessons, they were violations. And Snape offered no apology. Not once did he acknowledge the pain he caused. No reassurance, no explanation. Just that perpetual scowl, that superiority, that bitter, simmering resentment. Once Harry stumbled out of the session head-pounding, vision blurred, and found himself at the foot of a statue in the corridor. He leaned against it, trembling. Ron asked what was going on, but Harry couldn't say. How do you explain the feeling of someone reaching into your soul and pulling out your secrets with cold hands? Snape didn't limit this treatment to Harry. There are hints, subtle but telling, that he employed legilimency casually with other students. In Goblet of Fire, when interrogating Harry about the Triwizard Tournament, Snape leans in and fixes him with a gaze described as searching and calculating. Harry later wonders if Snape had used legilimency again. The idea that students could be subject to such magical interrogation without knowledge or consent is chilling. But with Harry, it was personal. Snape hated the boy, not only for being James Potter's son, but for resembling Lily, the woman he had loved and lost. The emotional complexity of that hatred turned every lesson into a vendetta. And while Harry bore the brunt of it, Snape disguised his cruelty as education. In one particularly cruel moment, Snape penetrated a memory of Harry being chased by Dudley's gang. Harry was 8, alone, cornered, and the laughter of his cousin still rang in his ears. Snape watched the scene unfold, and when it was over, he sneered. "You didn't even try to fight back." The implication was clear. Weakness deserved ridicule, but it wasn't weakness, it was a child's terror, and Snape made no effort to teach occlumency gently. There were no explanations about shields, about mental discipline, no meditations or visualizations, just pain, just Legilimens again and again, until Harry began to dread each step toward the dungeon. It wasn't training, it was punishment. The hypocrisy was stunning. Snape himself was an occlumens, a master at guarding his own mind. Dumbledore had trusted him for that reason, but instead of sharing that wisdom, he used it as a weapon. He turned an art of defense into an instrument of torment. What kind of educator views a child's trauma as a tool? What kind of adult peers into a teenager's heartache and scoffs? Snape crossed boundaries that no teacher should ever cross, and Hogwarts, for all its wonder, looked away. Even when Harry dared to fight back, when he used Protego and glimpsed Snape's own memory of humiliation at the hands of James, it was Harry who was punished. Snape's fury was explosive. He cancelled the lessons immediately, not because he'd done wrong, but because his own secrets had been touched. The double standard was glaring. Snape could plunder Harry's mind, but the moment the tables turned, he called it unforgivable. The incident revealed another truth. Snape's own pain had not softened him, it had hardened him. He believed cruelty was the only teacher. He saw Harry not as a child in need of help, but as a proxy for his own unresolved grief and rage. Years later, readers would learn that Snape had worked tirelessly to protect Harry, motivated by his love for Lily. But that truth does not erase the abuse. It complicates it. Snape's motivations were noble, perhaps, but his methods were unforgivable. There's a moment in Order of the Phoenix when Harry wonders why he feels worse after the lessons, not better. Why his dreams grow darker. Why the connection to Voldemort deepens. Snape's training was not just ineffective, it was counterproductive. His invasions left Harry more vulnerable, not less. Because trauma doesn't vanish through confrontation, it deepens. When Hermione heard about the lessons, she was horrified. "He's breaking into your mind, without warning?" she asked, her eyes wide. She, like any rational person, understood the gravity of what was happening, but no one stopped it. Because it was Snape. Because Dumbledore trusted him. Because Harry was expected to endure. But being brave does not mean being unprotected. Being strong does not mean accepting violation. Snape's legilimency was not an act of love. It was not care. It was control, domination. A man using his power not to uplift, but to crush. And still Harry never told. He never filed a complaint, never begged for it to stop, because part of him, raised unloved, had come to accept mistreatment as normal. And perhaps that's the most heartbreaking part of all. Snape was a complex man, a double agent, a war hero, a tragic figure. But in those dark chambers, with his wand pointed at a boy's temple, he was something else entirely. He was the abuser of trust.
"Legilimens," he whispered. And with that word, Harry lost another piece of himself.
Not to Voldemort, but to a man who claimed to be on the right side, and that may be the greatest betrayal of all. Number 22, mocked Tonks' grief. Nymphadora Tonks stood near the fireplace at 12 Grimmauld Place, her hair dulled to a lifeless brown, her shoulders slouched forward like someone twice her age. The vibrant, mischievous metamorph magus who had once lit up any room she walked into was gone, replaced by a shadow of grief. The death of Sirius Black had gutted her in ways few could understand. He wasn't just a cousin. He had been the last thread tying her to the wild, rebellious part of her heritage that didn't look down on her for being half-blood. He was kin who saw her for who she was. And he had died, screaming, falling through the veil while she lay unconscious from a Death Eater's curse. When Tonks returned to duty with the Order of the Phoenix, something fundamental had changed in her. She moved more slowly. She spoke less. The jokes, the clumsiness, the flashes of purple and pink hair, gone. The light inside her dimmed under the crushing weight of loss. And it was in this broken state that Severus Snape, as cold and cutting as always, found his opportunity to strike. During a grim meeting in the summer after Sirius's death, with members gathered around the long table at headquarters, Snape's voice sliced through the tension like a jagged blade. "Aura Tonks," he said smoothly, "I trust your emotional fragility no longer interferes with your ability to contribute."
No one spoke. Kingsley Shacklebolt's brow furrowed. Remus Lupin looked down at the table, fists clenched. But Tonks said nothing. Her eyes did not rise. She simply nodded, lips pressed tight, hair unchanged.
Snape's jab was more than unprofessional. It was cruel. He knew exactly how much Sirius had meant to her. He knew the bond they shared, the laughter they'd exchanged, the memories of family redeemed. And yet, in a moment when Tonks most needed support, Snape used her mourning as ammunition. "She's let her grief compromise her usefulness to the Order," he had said, as if Sirius's death had merely inconvenienced her capacity as a soldier. This moment, which passes quietly in the books, is illuminated in Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince, when Remus explains Tonks's grief to Harry. She's gone all quiet and, well, her hair's turned mousy brown. Later, it's implied that her sorrow and depression stem from both the loss of Sirius and her love for Remus. But between the lines lies Snape's venom. He saw weakness in Tonks and chose to amplify it rather than offer sympathy. Cruelty is made worse by context. Snape, of all people, knew what grief was. He'd lost Lily Evans and had lived with that sorrow for decades. Yet he offered Tonks no empathy. If anything, he seemed to revel in her collapse, as if her pain were a weakness worth exploiting. In doing so, he exposed a part of himself that many fans try to forgive but cannot ignore, his fundamental lack of compassion. Even Dumbledore, ever the master of subtle rebukes, had to restrain Snape at times. In Order of the Phoenix, we're shown how easily Snape slips into bitterness. He mocks, he ridicules, he isolates. His scathing tongue is legendary, but against Tonks it cut too deep. It wasn't a duel, it wasn't defense. It was assault, verbal, emotional, calculated. After the meeting, Tonks lingered behind, the last to leave the table. Lupin approached her gently, whispering something that made her close her eyes. Her hands trembled as she pushed her chair back. "He's right," she muttered, voice like gravel. "I haven't been any good, I can't focus. I just see Sirius everywhere, in the house, in the fire. I keep thinking I'll hear him laugh again." But no one did. And Snape certainly didn't want to. His hatred for Sirius had been volcanic, simmering beneath the surface since their school days. To him, Sirius's death was not a tragedy, it was a poetic ending. And Tonks's mourning, collateral damage. It's this moment that challenges the idea of Snape as a good man, not because he was unpleasant, not because he lacked social grace, but because he actively chose cruelty when he could have chosen silence. He could have let her grief pass unmentioned, but instead he twisted the knife. In fan circles, Snape is often defended as misunderstood, a tragic hero shaped by pain. And yet, how do we reconcile that with the man who looked at a grieving woman and said, in effect, "Pull yourself together or be useless"? There's no nobility in that, no honor, only venom. Even Harry, who eventually learns of Snape's sacrifice and regrets his judgments, never truly forgets how cruel Snape was to people who hadn't earned it. "Snape's always been foul to people he dislikes," he says in Half-Blood Prince, his tone unmistakably bitter. Why would Tonks be any different? And she wasn't. To Snape, Tonks represented Sirius, light-hearted, bold Gryffindor. That was enough for him to hate her. But more than that, she represented feelings, the very things Snape had learned to suppress. Her grief was a mirror to his own, and rather than face it, he mocked it. Snape's behavior in this moment cannot be excused as strategy. This wasn't about the Order or protecting secrets. It wasn't occlumency or deception. It was personal. a bitter man seeing someone wounded and kicking them anyway. Years later, when Tonks and Remus both died in the Battle of Hogwarts, it's tempting to wonder whether Snape ever thought of her again, whether he remembered her pale face in the meeting room, the silence she carried, the weight of sorrow he so carelessly dismissed. But there's no evidence he did. Tonks was never his enemy. She was never a threat. She was simply a colleague, a young woman shattered by loss. And Snape, instead of helping her rebuild, tore her further down. It wasn't necessary. It wasn't strategic. It was petty cruelty. In the books, J.K. Rowling doesn't dwell on this moment, but its impact lingers. Tonks's change after Sirius's death is deeply felt. Her depression is real, heavy, and transformative. And Snape's response to that reveals something essential about his character, that while he may have fought on the right side, his heart remained closed.
"I'm fine," Tonks had said later, brushing past Lupin in a hallway, though her eyes betrayed the truth. Everyone's got someone to lose. But she didn't forget Snape's words. She carried them, the way wounded people carry offhand cruelty like splinters buried under the skin.
So when people ask, was Snape good? This moment must be part of the answer. Good people do not mock the grieving. Good people do not weaponize loss. And good people do not stand above others in pain and call them weak. Severus Snape was many things: brilliant, loyal in his own way, brave in moments. But he was not kind. And in this world, where grief comes for everyone eventually, kindness is what separates the heroes from the villains. Not everyone is remembered for their silence, but Snape, that day, could have chosen to say nothing. He could have walked past Tonks without speaking. He could have let her mourn in peace. But he didn't. And that choice defines him more than any potion he brewed or secret he kept. In the end, Tonks did return to herself. She fell in love, she married, she had a son. She found hope again. But what stayed with her, what stayed with those who watched, was that even among allies, pain can be made worse, not by war or loss, but by a single cold voice in a quiet room. Number 23. Abused his power as a teacher. Of all the figures who walked the halls of Hogwarts, few left behind such a tangled legacy as Severus Snape. Feared, admired, and ultimately pitied, Snape remains a divisive character. But one truth stands firm, regardless of which side of the argument you fall on. Severus Snape repeatedly abused his power as a professor. Again and again, he used his position not as a tool of guidance, but as a weapon to belittle, intimidate, and dominate. He was not merely strict, he was cruel, particularly to those he saw as weak or simply unworthy of his respect. Neville Longbottom became one of the earliest victims of Snape's scorn. A shy, clumsy boy with a good heart and a troubled past, Neville was exactly the kind of student a caring teacher might nurture. But Snape saw only weakness and made a public sport of it. During their very first potions lesson, Snape demanded that Harry answer a series of impossible questions. When Hermione raised her hand eagerly, Snape ignored her and snapped, "For your information, Potter, asphodel and wormwood make a sleeping potion so powerful it is known as the draught of living death." He didn't want learning, he wanted obedience, and for Neville the lessons became a battlefield. In Prisoner of Azkaban, Neville's greatest fear, as revealed by the boggart, was none other than Professor Snape himself. What kind of teacher inspires such dread in a child? Instead of helping Neville build confidence, Snape actively crushed it. In the Chamber of Secrets, when Neville melts Seamus's cauldron in class, Snape sneers, "Longbottom, at the end of this lesson we will find out whether you've been mixing your potions correctly. If you have, we'll find out why everyone in Gryffindor has been losing points for your stupidity." It wasn't just reprimanding, it was humiliation. In front of his peers, Neville wasn't given a chance to learn, he was made an example of. And this wasn't an isolated incident, it was a pattern. Luna Lovegood, though less frequently in his classroom, would have likely faced the same disdain had their paths crossed more often. Eccentric, dreamy, and unafraid to be different, Luna was exactly the kind of student Snape loathed. Though the books don't give us direct interactions between the two, her unorthodox thinking and odd beliefs would have made her an easy target for the cold sarcasm Snape so frequently used. After all, he barely tolerated even those who followed the rules if they didn't align with his own rigid expectations. Then there's Hermione Granger. Though she was the brightest student in her year, Snape didn't treat her with the respect a teacher might show to a gifted pupil. Instead, he mocked her, ridiculed her enthusiasm, and even insulted her appearance. In The Prisoner of Azkaban, he snarled, "You insufferable know-it-all," when she dared to answer a question in class. Ron Weasley, usually oblivious to classroom dynamics, jumped to her defense. "You asked us a question and she knows the answer. Why ask if you don't want to be told?" Snape docked points from Gryffindor. His ego could not tolerate being outshone, even by a 12-year-old girl. Snape's favoritism towards Slytherins made his abuse even more glaring. While Gryffindors were scolded for minor infractions, Slytherins were let off for the same behavior. Draco Malfoy, in particular, benefited from this bias. In The Philosopher's Stone, when Malfoy steals Neville's Remembrall and flies off with it, Professor McGonagall punishes him. But when Gryffindors committed similar acts, Snape was merciless. He didn't just show bias, he institutionalized it, embedding fear and inequality into the fabric of his classroom. Harry Potter, of course, was the prime recipient of Snape's antagonism. From their very first meeting, Snape projected his hatred of James Potter onto his son. In The Philosopher's Stone, Snape corners Harry in his very first potions class and grills him with obscure questions no first year could answer. "Clearly, fame isn't everything," he sneers, revealing his personal grudge rather than any pedagogical concern. It wasn't education, it was punishment by proxy. Time and again, Snape used his position to pursue personal vendettas. In The Order of the Phoenix, when Harry has a vision of Sirius in the Department of Mysteries, he begs Snape for help. But Snape, knowing full well what the cryptic message might mean, chooses to remain cold and ambiguous. Though he ultimately takes steps to help, his initial response is marked by disdain and indifference. His pride always outweighed his duty to the students. In The Goblet of Fire, Snape goes so far as to physically assault Harry. When he believes Harry has stolen ingredients from his private stores, he snarls, "Get out, Potter, get out!" and grabs him by the arm. The moment is brief, but it illustrates a broader truth. Snape's control over his emotions was fragile at best. Even as an adult, he allowed himself to lash out at children when they bruised his ego. Snape's treatment of students wasn't just cruel, it was dangerous. In The Half-Blood Prince, he gives Harry detentions that involve cleaning cauldrons without magic. While this might seem benign, it's a subtle form of degradation, particularly considering the magical solutions available. Snape wasn't interested in rehabilitation or discipline. He wanted to break Harry, to remind him of his place. Even more disturbing is the way Snape handled students in danger. When Draco Malfoy begins to spiral under the weight of his mission from Voldemort, Snape's concern is mechanical. He swears an unbreakable vow to protect the boy, but it's not out of compassion. It's a chess move. His protection is a calculation in a much larger game, one in which the students are pawns, not people. Draco's suffering is never directly addressed, only the strategic implications of his failure. In The Prisoner of Azkaban, Snape's obsession with Sirius Black leads him to endanger students. He assigns a ridiculous number of essays, hoping to uncover secrets about the marauders, and when Harry sneaks into Hogsmeade, Snape is quick to accuse and punish. His vendetta against Sirius, Remus and James clouded his professional judgment at every turn. Even when Remus Lupin was trying to do the right thing as a teacher, Snape deliberately exposed his secret, leading to Lupin's resignation. Snape's abuse extended beyond the classroom. In the Order of the Phoenix, during occlumency lessons, he invades Harry's mind with relish. He doesn't teach, he assaults. Harry even notes how harsh Snape is during these sessions, showing no patience, no guidance, only hostility. When Harry accidentally accesses Snape's memories instead of using the opportunity to explain or create empathy, Snape explodes and ends the lessons. It was always about control, never connection. A teacher's power lies not just in knowledge, but in influence, and Snape's influence, for many, was toxic. He didn't just fail to uplift his students, he taught them that intelligence without cruelty was weakness, that silence was safer than truth, and that some people were simply not worthy of kindness. His classroom was a kingdom of fear, and he ruled it with icy detachment. It's easy to romanticize Snape's complexity, to highlight his bravery and sacrifice. But the truth is, bravery does not excuse abuse. He may have played a key role in defeating Voldemort, but that doesn't absolve his years of belittling children, of choosing humiliation over help, of letting his bitterness seep into every lesson. Redemption is not a time machine. It doesn't erase pain caused. There are moments when Snape seemed to want more. His protection of Harry from the shadows is undeniable. But even this was rooted in guilt over Lily's death, not affection for Harry himself. His grief did not manifest as love, it curdled into resentment. And the children of Hogwarts bore the weight of that poisoned grief. In Deathly Hallows, when Snape dies and passes his memories to Harry, we see his human side. We see love, loss, and regret. But we must be careful not to mistake those moments for the totality of his character. For years he chose cruelty. For years he hurt the very people he was supposed to protect. He may have been a hero in the shadows, but in the light of day he was a tormentor cloaked in authority. Snape's power was immense, both magical and institutional, but rather than using it to shelter the vulnerable, he turned it against them. In doing so, he betrayed the very ideals he claimed to fight for. Dumbledore once said, "It is our choices that show what we truly are, far more than our abilities." Snape chose to wield his power as a blade rather than a shield, and that choice defines him just as much as his ultimate sacrifice. A good teacher sees potential where others see failure. A good teacher uplifts even when the student struggles. Snape saw only reflections of his past and punished students for sins they never committed. For all his complexities, for all his bravery, this truth remains. Severus Snape abused his authority, and the scars of that abuse linger far longer than any potion he ever brewed. Number 24. Did nothing to support Harry emotionally. Of all the teachers Harry Potter encountered at Hogwarts, none were as antagonistic and cold toward him as Severus Snape. This animosity wasn't merely professional distance or even stern discipline. It was personal, persistent, and often cruel. Though Snape had sworn to protect Harry out of loyalty to Lily Evans, and under the directive of Albus Dumbledore, he did absolutely nothing to alleviate the boy's emotional burden. If anything, he added to it with a consistency that bordered on obsession. Snape's actions, far from neutral, served to make Harry's life at Hogwarts not only difficult, but in many instances emotionally scarring. From the very first potions class, Snape made it unmistakably clear that Harry would not receive fairness, let alone kindness, in his classroom. "You are here to learn the subtle science and exact art of potion-making," Snape began, eyes glittering coldly. Then, with barely a beat, he turned to Harry and hissed, "You are Potter, I believe. That is correct. Your fame precedes you." The sarcasm hung heavy in the air, his voice like a drawn knife. It wasn't just disapproval, it was disdain. He saw not a student, but the son of a man he loathed. Whatever Harry had suffered before coming to Hogwarts, Snape never allowed him a fresh start. There were many moments when Snape could have chosen silence, neutrality, or even the smallest gesture of human decency. But instead he singled Harry out time and again. In their very first lesson, when Harry answered a question correctly, Snape responded not with encouragement but with suspicion and a threat. Fame isn't everything. The lesson Harry learned that day wasn't about potions, it was about being targeted. In that moment, any chance for Harry to feel safe or welcome in Snape's class was shattered. Snape chose to be Harry's tormentor when he could have simply been his professor. Snape's punishments often bordered on petty cruelty. In Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets, when Harry accidentally caused a commotion in class, Snape leapt at the chance to dock points and assign a detention, not to teach discipline, but to humiliate. This wasn't an isolated event. Again and again, Harry was punished not according to his actions, but according to Snape's seething resentment. When Draco Malfoy insulted Hermione by calling her a mudblood, Snape pretended not to hear. But when Harry or Ron retaliated verbally, Snape was quick to penalize them. The hypocrisy wasn't just visible, it was brutal. During third year, the situation grew worse. When the Boggart class, with Professor Lupin, exposed Snape wearing Neville Longbottom's grandmother's clothes, because that was Neville's worst fear, Snape turned his ire not on Lupin, who had allowed the lesson, but on Harry and his friends. He glared at them in the hallway, humiliated by laughter he assumed they had spread. Never did he reflect that perhaps his treatment of students had inspired such fear. Instead, he brooded and lashed out further. The emotional environment he cultivated for Harry was toxic, filled with mistrust and passive aggression. And yet Snape was not unaware of Harry's life outside Hogwarts. He knew of the Dursleys, the neglect, the cupboard under the stairs. Dumbledore trusted Snape with sensitive information. Surely Snape knew that Harry's life had been one of loneliness, hunger, and silence. But he did nothing to make Hogwarts a place of healing or stability. Not once did he offer Harry a kind word or the benefit of the doubt. He simply added to the weight Harry carried, confirming the boy's belief that authority figures could not be trusted. In the Order of the Phoenix, Snape's conduct took an even darker turn. During occlumency lessons, which were meant to help Harry block Voldemort from entering his mind, Snape was cruel, dismissive, and aggressive. "Clear your mind, Potter," he barked again and again, never bothering to explain the method, never guiding, only commanding. When Harry failed, Snape showed no patience. When Harry accidentally entered Snape's own memories and saw the bullying of young Severus, the professor responded not with introspection, but with fury. He ended the lessons altogether. His own shame outweighed Harry's need for protection. Snape's unwillingness to even treat Harry neutrally wasn't due to incompetence. It was a choice. He treated Draco Malfoy with a calm, measured authority. He gave Slytherin students second chances, encouragement, and even leniency. When Draco failed to brew a potion correctly, Snape corrected him gently. But when Hermione offered a correct answer in class, Snape snarled, "That is correct, but 5 points from Gryffindor for your insufferable know-it-all attitude." This wasn't teaching, it was tyranny, and it left lasting scars on those it targeted. Harry was not a perfect student, nor was he always respectful. But he was also a child who had lost both parents, who carried the trauma of the Dursley household, and who bore the weight of being the boy who lived. That burden alone should have inspired the smallest amount of compassion in any adult. but Snape refused even that. In fact, he used Harry's resemblance to James Potter as an excuse to hate him. "You look so like your father," Snape once muttered with venom. It didn't matter who Harry was. To Snape, he was merely a ghost of James and therefore a target. One could argue that Snape's protection of Harry was an act of love, his undying love for Lily Evans. But love, true love, does not punish a child for the sins of a father. Snape's love for Lily never extended to Harry himself. It was twisted, obsessive, and conditional. When Dumbledore reminded Snape that Harry was his mother's son, Snape snapped back, "He has her eyes." That's all Harry ever was to Snape, her eyes in a face he hated. Protection born out of obligation is not the same as kindness. In The Half-Blood Prince, Snape's role as protector remained hidden under layers of deception, but even then, when he could have offered guidance or peace to Harry, he instead humiliated him in front of the class, mocked his academic abilities, and belittled his friendships. When Harry began excelling in potions using the prince's book, Snape was furious, not impressed. He didn't ask how Harry had improved. He accused him of cheating. The moment Harry showed promise outside of Snape's control, he became a threat to be squashed, not a student to be nurtured. The ultimate irony was that Snape, for all his cleverness and complexity, never realized that his cruelty only drove Harry further from him. Dumbledore once said, "It is our choices, Harry, that show what we truly are." Snape had many opportunities to choose differently. He could have been a silent protector, firm but fair, distant but not malicious. But he chose to be vindictive, to relive his old grudges through the eyes of a child who had nothing to do with them. And that choice made Harry's years at Hogwarts harder than they needed to be. Even during the Triwizard Tournament, when Harry faced mortal danger, Snape did nothing to offer comfort or encouragement. He sat silently while the other teachers questioned Harry's involvement. When Harry's name emerged from the Goblet of Fire, Snape's eyes narrowed. He offered no support, no vote of confidence. He stood with the skeptics. Even when danger loomed, Snape could not shed his prejudice. He might have been protecting Harry from the shadows, but in the light, he was just another adult who refused to believe in him. Snape's most painful betrayal came not through actions, but through omissions. He never told Harry the truth. Not about his mother, not about his own role in the war, and certainly not about the prophecy. That responsibility fell to Dumbledore. And when Dumbledore finally began to trust Harry with knowledge, it was too late. Snape, despite having shared memories with Dumbledore, refused to trust the boy. He never gave Harry the dignity of truth. He saw him as a liability, not a partner in the fight against Voldemort. And perhaps the most tragic part is that Harry might have forgiven him, had Snape given him any reason to. Harry was not unkind by nature. He was capable of immense empathy, even toward people who had hurt him. He understood Dudley, pitied Draco, and even offered forgiveness to Wormtail. But Snape? Snape never gave him a single moment of grace to build on. Their final connection came only after death, when Snape's memories revealed the truth. By then it was too late for healing. One can admire Snape's bravery. One can respect his role in the war. One can even mourn the complexity of his character. But one cannot excuse the way he treated a grieving child. In the end, Snape's legacy is a mirror of Hogwarts itself, full of hidden truths, unexplored corridors, and shadows that haunt even the brightest places. He protected Harry's life, but he did nothing for Harry's heart. And so when the reader looks back, they see a man who stood between life and death, who bore the unbearable for love, but who forgot that love must also be given, not just clung to like a weapon, Snape's silence, his cruelty, his refusal to ease Harry's burden, even a little, even once. That is the wound that never healed. Harry, for all his battles, should have found sanctuary in the walls of Hogwarts. But with Snape around, even the castle felt colder. Every sneer, every insult, every point taken for no reason, it all added up. And in a place where magic could heal bones and regrow skin, there was no spell for the hurt inflicted by a teacher who simply could not let go of hate. And in the quiet moments when Harry sat in the common room, staring into the fire, wondering why it was always him, why danger followed him, why people died for him, why he never felt safe, not once did Snape try to lift that weight. Not once did he say, "You are not alone," not even when he knew that Harry, above all else, needed to hear it. That is what Snape never gave, not love, not kindness, not peace, only protection. And sometimes that is not enough. Number 25, killed Dumbledore without hesitation. Under the pale light of the astronomy tower, Severus Snape raised his wand. Avada Kedavra! The flash of green light burst into the night, and Albus Dumbledore, the greatest wizard of his time, flew backward, his arms spread wide like broken wings, before plummeting to his death. Below, on the grounds of Hogwarts, his body lay lifeless beneath the stars he loved so much. Those who saw the scene would never forget it. Nor would they forget the man who had delivered the final blow. Snape didn't flinch. He didn't hesitate. His face was carved in stone, unreadable, unmoving, untouched by emotion. That was the most terrifying part. Not the spell itself. Deadly, yes, but known to all who studied the dark arts. What haunted Harry Potter as he stood there, paralyzed under his invisibility cloak, was how calmly, how deliberately Snape executed the man who had trusted him above all others. From the outside, the killing seemed merciless, and that was the image Snape allowed the world to see. A man who didn't blink, who didn't question, who raised his wand at his mentor, his protector, and took his life with the ease of one casting lumos. It was cold, it was calculated, and for those who didn't know the truth behind it, it was unforgivable. Yet even when the truth came to light that Dumbledore had, in fact, asked Snape to kill him to spare Draco Malfoy from becoming a murderer, to protect Voldemort from discovering the headmaster's impending death from a cursed ring, one unsettling fact remained. Snape did not show a shred of emotion in that moment. He killed as if it were routine. He didn't waver, didn't falter, didn't weep. His silence became its own accusation.
As Dumbledore raised his eyes to meet Snape's, he whispered just one word, "Severus." Please. Was it a plea to save him, or a final confirmation to proceed? The ambiguity of that moment is burned into the minds of every reader. But Snape did not respond with words. He responded with death. He obeyed the request not with pain in his eyes, but with chilling detachment.
There was no visible struggle, no inward conflict. Snape did not tremble with grief, nor did he flinch as he watched Dumbledore fall. That eerie stillness was what made the act feel so monstrous. The man who had once been a spy, a Death Eater, a double agent, stood there as judge, jury, and executioner, and his face betrayed nothing. Even when Harry later confronts him in a white-hot rage, shouting, "He trusted you!" In Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince, Snape merely turns, his expression blank, and says, "Don't call me coward." It is the only hint of emotion we see. And even that rage is not grief, it is pride, a man defending his name, not mourning a fallen friend. This moment challenges the notion of Snape as a tragic hero. Yes, he loved Lily Potter. Yes, he risked everything to protect her son. But that night, when Dumbledore died, Snape's soul did not scream. He did not cry out in anguish. He did what he had to do, but he did it like a man who had killed before and could kill again. It is impossible to ignore how methodically Snape moved through those final moments. After casting the killing curse, he did not pause beside Dumbledore's body. He did not glance down or mutter a farewell. He fled as planned with Draco and the other Death Eaters, but he didn't look back. He didn't even pretend to care. This absence of humanity is disturbing, because no matter how noble the cause, taking a life, especially the life of someone who trusted you, should never come without a cost. Yet Snape paid nothing, at least not visibly. No sorrow clouded his face, no guilt curved his shoulders, just purpose and precision. One might argue that this emotional detachment was necessary for the success of the mission, that if Snape had shown hesitation, Voldemort might have suspected betrayal. But this explanation doesn't erase what we saw. Dumbledore had been the only person to believe in Snape's redemption, and Snape extinguished that light without blinking. Harry himself grapples with this. In the Deathly Hallows, even after learning Snape's full story through the pensive, he reflects, Snape's hatred of James had coloured his whole life, even as he tried to protect Harry. There is admiration there, yes, but also discomfort, because a man who can kill so coldly, no matter the reason, is not easy to forgive. Consider the parallels. When Sirius Black faced death, he laughed in defiance. When Remus Lupin fell, he did so with courage, fighting for a world where his son might be free. When Fred Weasley died, the room shattered with grief. But Snape? Snape delivered death like a professional, like an assassin fulfilling a contract. Even Draco Malfoy, just 16 years old, trembled when tasked with killing Dumbledore. His wand shook in his hand, his voice cracked, he stalled, begging Dumbledore for a way out. That was human, that was real. But Snape? Snape stepped into the moment with the grace of someone long accustomed to ending lives. Was it bravery? Perhaps, but bravery does not look like apathy. It does not wear a mask of ice. It does not silence the tremble of the hand or the tear in the eye. Snape's behavior in that moment was not that of a man torn apart by the weight of duty. It was that of someone who had embraced the role of executioner. Let us not forget that this was not Snape's first killing. As a Death Eater, he had participated in Voldemort's regime. He had sent information that led to the deaths of Lily and James Potter. Redemption is powerful, yes, but it does not erase a man's capacity for violence. And Snape's capacity was immense. He was a man forged in darkness, trained to show no weakness. Dumbledore saw that and used it. But even the headmaster might not have anticipated how effortless Snape would make it look. There's something haunting in that. Something that lingers long after the tower goes silent. In The Half-Blood Prince, J.K. Rowling writes, there was revulsion and hatred etched in the lines of his face. But that revulsion is aimed not at Dumbledore, but at the situation, at the burden. Still, it doesn't excuse the absence of mourning. The man who once called Dumbledore his guide, his only friend in the Order, stood over his death with a heart seemingly untouched. This is why some fans can never fully embrace Snape's redemption arc. Because at the core of his most critical moment, he remained emotionally sealed. The man who loved Lily with unbearable pain could not summon a single tear for Dumbledore, and that contradiction is hard to reconcile. Severus Snape is a character of layers, yes, a man of secrets, of suffering, of sacrifice, but also a man capable of terrifying emotional restraint. When he pointed his wand and whispered that fatal curse, he did not just end Dumbledore's life. He revealed a part of himself that even the truth about Lily couldn't soften. It is this moment, this single, unforgettable act, that defines Snape in the eyes of many. Not the memories he gave Harry, not the doe Patronus, flickering in the woods, but the cold, quiet way he killed a man who trusted him. The way he stood on that tower with the stars above and death below and chose silence over sorrow. Perhaps that was his final mask, the last layer of armor around a wounded soul. But even if that's true, the image remains, a man who kills with grace and walks away without looking back. And that image, once burned into memory, never truly fades. Number 26 was willing to sacrifice innocence. It is easy to romanticize the tragic figure of Severus Snape, the man who lived a double life, who protected Harry Potter while hating everything he stood for, who bore a love so deep for Lily Evans that he turned against the Dark Lord himself. But this romanticism often blinds us to the very real, very chilling truth. Severus Snape once stood on the side of darkness with eyes wide open. He was not duped. He was not dragged. He walked into Voldemort's circle willingly, knowingly, and perhaps most disturbingly, with a heart that still held the capacity to love. That makes his betrayal of innocence even more haunting. For he wasn't a monster devoid of emotion. He was a man who could have chosen differently but didn't until it was too late for so many. Snape's recruitment into the Death Eaters did not happen overnight. He had been dabbling with dark magic since his teenage years at Hogwarts, associating with students who would go on to become Voldemort's loyal followers. "There was a group of us," Sirius Black once said in Order of the Phoenix, "all into the dark arts. Some of them turned out worse than others." Snape was one of them. Even then, his obsession with blood purity and power was growing. He called Lily Evans a mudblood in a moment of fury, not just a careless insult, but a revelation of his inner alignment. And yet, even as he claimed to love her, he walked directly into the service of the one wizard who would see her and her kind exterminated. That contradiction speaks volumes. When Snape became a Death Eater, he knew what it meant. Voldemort's ideology was not a secret. The Dark Lord had already begun his war against Muggleborns and blood traitors, the murders, the disappearances, the fear that swept the wizarding world. It was all very real by the time Snape offered his loyalty. He did not hesitate. He did not stall. He became part of the machinery that hunted the innocent. The nature of his participation is often glossed over in fan discussions, but make no mistake, Snape was ready to give Voldemort whatever was asked of him, even if that meant the lives of people who had done nothing wrong. One of the most disturbing examples lies in his involvement with the prophecy. Snape was the one who overheard Sybil Trelawney's words in the Hog's Head and ran straight to Voldemort. At that moment, he had no idea who the child in the prophecy was. He didn't care. He heard of a child born as the 7th month dies who had the potential to defeat the Dark Lord, and he offered that information without hesitation. In doing so, he set a death sentence on an unnamed baby and his parents. He had no concern for their identity, for their innocence, or for the consequences. The prophecy said the one with the power to vanquish the Dark Lord approaches, and Snape delivered it like a weapon. Only later, when Voldemort decided that the child in question was Harry Potter, and that Lily Evans, now Lily Potter, would be among the targets, did Snape attempt to intervene. And even then his appeal was grotesquely limited. "Hide them all, then," Dumbledore said coldly, in the Deathly Hallows, quoting Snape's own words. "Keep her, them, safe." Snape did not plead for James Potter's life. He did not even mention Harry. His request was not for the protection of the innocent. It was for the salvation of one person, the one he loved, and he was willing to let the rest perish if it meant she might live. What does that say about his morality, about his soul? It is easy to say he was blinded by love, but love does not excuse the willingness to offer others to the jaws of death. He handed over the prophecy knowing that someone, likely a baby, was going to die. Only when that someone turned out to be Lily's child did he feel the cold hand of regret, and yet even then his efforts were not heroic. They were selfish. "You disgust me," Dumbledore said, not out of cruelty, but out of horror. Snape's redemption began only when he saw that even his plea for Lily had failed. But the damage was already done. James and Lily were dead. Voldemort had killed them. And Snape, overwhelmed with grief, threw himself at Dumbledore's feet, not to confess, not to atone, but to beg for the child to live. And why? Because Harry was Lily's son, because a trace of her lived on in him, not because he suddenly cared about the innocent or the cause of good. It was personal. It was always personal.
Dumbledore, shrewd as ever, knew this. He allowed Snape to protect Harry, not because he trusted him, but because he recognized the power of guilt. "He has her eyes," Dumbledore often reminded Snape, a cruel and necessary reminder of why Snape must continue his dangerous role. But that does not erase the past. That does not absolve the choice Snape made when he was ready to trade lives like pawns. If Voldemort had interpreted the prophecy differently, if the child had been Neville Longbottom, for example, Snape would have gone on with his life, uncaring, untroubled. How many other nameless children met death at the hands of the Death Eaters during Snape's service? How many did he help destroy?
There's no evidence that Snape ever actively tried to sabotage Voldemort's plans before Lily was in danger. He wasn't a spy until it hurt him personally. That means, for a time, he stood among those who tortured, killed, and terrorized the innocent. Bellatrix Lestrange, Antonin Dolohov, and others reveled in cruelty, but Snape is often treated as an outlier. Yet he was there. He was one of them. He wore the mark. He took the vows. He was willing. We can only imagine the conversations, the meetings, the plans he participated in. The Death Eaters weren't idle. They organized raids. They hunted Muggle-borns. They infiltrated institutions. Snape wasn't some detached academic. He was part of that infrastructure. The books don't say he killed, but they don't say he didn't. What they do say is that he kept company with murderers and said nothing. Silence in such moments is complicity. A man with a brilliant mind and a deep understanding of magic could have walked away. He didn't. When asked by Phineas Nigellus in the Deathly Hallows whether he cared for Harry, Snape replied with venom, "For him, expecto patronum." And with that word, his silver doe leapt into the air. It was a beautiful moment, poignant, but it was about Lily, always Lily. Snape's life revolved around one woman, and every moral decision he made hinged on her. That kind of love is not pure, it is obsession. And it doesn't redeem the fact that to preserve his own loyalty and ideology, he once stood on the wrong side of a war that cost thousands their lives. His role as a double agent was noble, his bravery immense. He protected Harry, deceived Voldemort, and ultimately gave his life. But none of these acts cancel out the truth that he was once ready to give Voldemort whoever Voldemort asked for, so long as Lily remained safe. That is not heroism. That is selective mercy. That is conditional morality. And for the families of those who were lost during Voldemort's rise, no amount of posthumous redemption can restore what was taken. Even Snape himself knew this. In The Prince's Tale, he is shown falling to his knees upon hearing of Lily's death, sobbing, shaking, broken. But regret does not cleanse the blood on one's hands. I wish I were dead," he told Dumbledore. But wishing is not penance. Grief is not justice, and while he lived the rest of his life trying to make amends in his own way, those early choices reveal a darkness that cannot be forgotten. It is easy to admire Snape's courage, to marvel at his complexity, to feel pity for his suffering. But we must not let that admiration cloud our judgment. He was ready to give Voldemort innocent people. He did give Voldemort innocent people. That truth is buried under layers of tragedy and sacrifice, but it is there, rotting beneath the surface. To forget it is to betray the memory of those who died by the hand of the very man Snape once served. In the end, Severus Snape is not a villain, nor is he a hero. He is a cautionary tale, a man who let his pain justify cruelty, a man who allowed ideology to override empathy, a man who only turned back when the cost hit too close to his heart. And even then, he did not seek forgiveness. He merely did what he could in silence, in shadows. "Look at me," he said to Harry as he died, needing to see her eyes one last time. And then he was gone. We may mourn him, we may respect him, but we must also remember him in full, not just the man who protected a boy, but the man who once was ready to deliver that boy to his death, not just the spy, but the servant, not just the heartbroken, but the destroyer. Because Severus Snape, for all his brilliance and sorrow, chose darkness first. And by the time he tried to undo that choice, the damage was irreversible. That is what makes his story so compelling and so terrifying. Because if a man who could love so deeply could still offer innocence to evil, what does that say about the nature of love, of loyalty, of redemption? Perhaps it says that none of us are safe from darkness, not even the ones who think they are saving the world. Number 27. Was cruel even to fellow professors. Severus Snape never needed a villain to act like one. He could conjure storms in peaceful skies and sow fear, even among the unsuspecting. His cruelty was not a weapon drawn only in battles with enemies. It was a cloak he wore in every corridor of Hogwarts. And perhaps the most revealing display of this came in the way he treated Professor Quirinus Quirrell during Harry Potter's first year. Now the world knows that Quirrell was not the timid, bumbling professor he appeared to be. Beneath that turban, hiding a terrible secret, he was the servant of Lord Voldemort. But what most forget, or perhaps never noticed, is that when Severus Snape began his campaign of torment against him, no one knew this. No one. Least of all, Snape himself. Their first interaction was not subtle. In the Great Hall, Snape's cold gaze often lingered on Quirrell longer than necessary. It wasn't mere suspicion, it was loathing. He watched the man with the same expression he gave Neville Longbottom's cauldron explosions, a blend of contempt, disgust, and cruel amusement. Yet Quirrell had done nothing to deserve such hatred, at least not at that point. He was, by all appearances, just another nervous academic trying to teach a class full of wide-eyed children how to survive the magical world. But to Snape, Quirrell's weakness was enough. Snape had no patience for those he deemed feeble. His disdain for vulnerability was etched into every word he spoke and every look he gave. Quirrell stammered. Snape sneered. Quirrell trembled when spoken to. Snape advanced like a predator, testing the limits of its prey. And when Quirrell turned away, Snape didn't simply look on with indifference. He made it his mission to humiliate him. This wasn't the subtle rivalry between colleagues. It wasn't quiet dislike or professional disagreement. It was war. And Snape was the only one fighting it. In one potions class, Harry overheard Snape mocking Quirrell's lesson plans. A three-headed dog guarding a trapdoor, and he teaches them to wave garlic at trolls, Snape had muttered in the staff room, unaware, or perhaps uncaring, that his voice carried beyond the door. Professor McGonagall had warned him to keep his remarks professional, but Snape was unmoved. "If you call that professional," he said, folding his arms, "then Hogwarts standards have fallen." What stung wasn't the sarcasm. It was that Snape said these things in front of students who then echoed those sentiments. In the Gryffindor common room, Seamus Finnegan once remarked, "Even Snape thinks Quirrell's hopeless, and Snape hates everyone." And it was true. Snape didn't just dislike Quirrell privately, he dismantled his credibility piece by piece, and he did it in plain sight. There was one particular moment, brief and bitter, that summed up their dynamic. During a dinner in the Great Hall, Snape leaned across the staff table and said, just loudly enough for several Slytherin students to hear, "You look pale, Quirinus. Trouble sleeping? Or is it just the burden of your own incompetence weighing on your conscience?" Quirrell choked on his pumpkin juice. The hall fell silent for a heartbeat, and then someone laughed, a short, cruel bark from the Slytherin end of the room. Quirrell tried to recover with a nervous smile, but Snape was already cutting into his steak as if nothing had happened. Snape wasn't trying to uncover the truth about Quirrell. He wasn't carefully observing laying traps or gathering intelligence. No, what he was doing was simpler and darker. He was bullying a man who appeared weaker than him. It was a pattern Snape repeated with students, Neville in particular, but with Quirrell it was more dangerous. This was an adult, a colleague, someone who had earned his position just as Snape had. And yet Snape treated him as vermin. The irony, of course, is that Quirrell truly was dangerous. The entire time Voldemort was lurking behind that nervous stutter and timid smile. But Snape didn't know that, not at first. His cruelty came long before any true suspicions arose. Dumbledore had his doubts. Snape, though, he had contempt. Even when he did begin to suspect Quirrell's motives, Snape didn't seek dialogue or resolution. He chose intimidation. As Harry witnessed during the Quidditch match, Snape's approach was not to report Quirrell quietly to Dumbledore, but to publicly glare at him, to mutter counter-curses, to follow him into the Forbidden Forest under the cover of night. "You don't want me as your enemy, Quirrell," Snape once hissed in the shadows, and the professor flinched as though struck. But why not just speak to him like an equal? Why not confront him with dignity? Why not investigate like a responsible teacher, like Remus Lupin would have done? Because Snape didn't do respect. He didn't extend courtesy unless it served his own ends. And to him, Quirrell was the perfect target, weak, awkward, and defenseless. His cruelty wasn't about justice, it was about dominance. Dumbledore, wise as he was, allowed teachers a certain freedom in how they dealt with one another. But even he couldn't have missed the tension. When Quirrell eventually died at the end of that year, his body collapsing in that underground chamber, Voldemort's shade escaping into the night, no one mourned him. No memorial was raised. But one can't help but wonder how much of that was due to the damage already done by Snape's relentless campaign. The students remembered. Years later, Harry would reflect on that first year and recall how every time Quirrell entered the room, he seemed smaller. Not just frightened, but belittled, worn down. Snape was never nice, Ron would say, but he really hated Quirrell, made him feel like dirt. Was Snape right to suspect him? Perhaps. But does being right give one permission to destroy another person's dignity? Snape often justified his cruelty under the guise of necessity. He abused Harry, yet told Dumbledore it was for the boy's protection. He terrorized Neville, yet claimed he was building character. And with Quirrell, he played the same game. But deep down, it wasn't about justice. It was about vengeance for a life he believed had robbed him of happiness. "You ought to be careful, Quirinus," Snape once said, tapping his wand on the staff table during a meeting. "Some of us aren't as forgiving as the headmaster." Quirrell gave a weak laugh, but his eyes darted down like a child scolded in front of adults. This was not a man seeking the truth. This was a man enjoying his power. Even after Quirrell's death, Snape never reflected on his behavior. He never once hinted that his methods had been too harsh. He never expressed regret that he had treated a fellow professor with open disdain. He believed his suspicions had been justified, and maybe they had, but justice without compassion is just cruelty in noble robes. Years later, Harry would remember the face of Quirrell, not the Voldemort side, but the professor who trembled and flinched, and he'd remember Snape's voice slicing through the great hall like a whip.
You're a fool, Quirinus.
The words had no spell behind them, no incantation, but they stung more than any hex. This memory didn't fit the tidy narrative the world tried to craft around Snape after his death. The brave double agent, the secret guardian, the man who loved Lily Potter so deeply that he risked everything. All of that may be true, but so is this. Snape was cruel even to those who never truly wronged him, even to those who trusted him, even to those who didn't yet deserve suspicion, because cruelty was not his disguise, it was his nature, and Quirrell was just one of its earliest victims.